14th floor of the Vantis Solutions building on Meridian Street has 41 offices, 2 conference rooms, and a break room that often smells faintly of burned coffee. There is also one door that no one wants to discuss. This door sits at the end of the eastern corridor, past the last group of cubicles and the water dispenser that gurgles at odd times. At first glance, it looks just like every other door on the floor. It has the same muted grey paint and the same brushed aluminum frame. However, there is no placard beside it and no room number on the wall. If you stand in that corridor long enough, you will notice the temperature drops a bit around the third office from the end. It's a steady, unexplainable chill that has nothing to do with the building's ventilation. The facilities team has never provided a written explanation. The fluorescent light above the door flickers, occasionally and without a discernible pattern. It's as if something connected to the same electrical line causes the light to tremble, briefly losing its certainty about the power it uses. Most people who work on the 14th floor do not linger in that corridor. They usually do not consider themselves superstitious. They are accounts coordinators, compliance analysts, and mid-level project managers who bring lunches in reusable containers and attend quarterly reviews without complaint. They don't believe in haunted rooms, yet the corridor empties faster than the others. Colleagues heading to the eastern stairwell often take a longer route without even realizing it. This behavior is a fact about the 14th floor, unspoken and unexamined, as many fears tend to be. The building manager, a careful man named Garrett, who has held the position since 2009, consistently deflects questions about the room. He describes it as containing legacy systems. Once, when a new hire asked too directly, he mentioned environmental monitoring equipment related to the previous occupants. His tone is not hostile, but it feels unsettling. It's the tone of someone reciting a script rather than offering his own thoughts. The maintenance crew follows standing orders that have been in place since before any current team member joined. The room is not part of their service rotation. It's not on any rotation. 2 former maintenance workers who have since left the company said that the directive was delivered verbally on their first day. They were told not to touch the door on faux, artine, not to assess it, and to route any questions to building management. Vantis Solutions bought the Meridian Street property in 1987, taking it over after a brief holding period following the dissolution of its previous tenant, a defense research contractor. The contractor's name still appears on the old mechanical drawings filed in the basement utility room. The room at the end of the eastern corridor was locked back then. It has remained locked since before anyone currently working in this building can remember. The building's institutional memory treats this as a simple fact, much like institutions do with things they choose not to question. Carla noticed the door on a Tuesday in February, 3 years ago. She is a mid-level accounts coordinator, competent, the kind of person who closely examines internal documents out of necessity rather than curiosity. She was cross-referencing a directory update with the physical floor layout, a routine task, when she discovered that the room at the end of the eastern corridor was not listed anywhere in the directory. It was not marked as inactive or restricted, simply absent, like a number missing from a sequence if whoever created the sequence decided that number should not exist. She assumed it was just an oversight. When she checked again the next morning and found it still missing, that's when she made the mistake of wanting to know why. Harwell-Bryce Defense Research filed for dissolution on a Tuesday in March 1983. Whatever they were doing on the 14th floor, they took their records with them. The company had occupied the building since its construction in 1961, when it was specifically designed as a research annex. It was a secondary facility, separated from the main Harwell-Bryce campus by 11 miles of city. This distinction mattered. Primary campuses have visitors, oversight committees, and inspectors from various agencies. A research annex on a quiet street does not. It has only its tenants and whatever they choose to keep quiet. The original blueprint submitted to the city during construction show 41 offices on the 14th floor and 2 conference rooms. One room is marked with no name no purpose, and no square footage notation. Just 2 letters, Section R. When Harwell-Bryce dissolved, it did so smoothly, like an organisation that had prepared for this moment. Assets were sold off. Staff were absorbed into other firms or dispersed. The building on Meridian Street changed hands within 8 months, passing to a regional property management group that held it without issue until 1979. Then it went to a real estate investment trust that kept it for 4 years before Vantis Solutions bought the property outright in 1987. In neither transaction does Section R appear in the transfer records. It isn't listed as a storage unit, utility room, or any sealed space that requires disclosure. The room seems to move through 3 decades of property law as if it doesn't exist. This would be unremarkable if the room itself didn't also seem to agree. A city records clerk named Dunmore pulled the original construction permits for the Meridian Street building in 2019, driven by simple curiosity during a slow week. What he found wasn't dramatic in the normal sense of discoveries. It was quiet and, in that quietness, much more unsettling. The building's construction permits were filed in a single batch in early 1960, covering the entire structure floor by floor, room by room, with the thoroughness common in municipal records of that era, all except one. The permit for Section R was filed separately, 6 months later, under a company name that doesn't appear in the surrounding pages or in the broader municipal archive for that year. It doesn't show up in any corporate registry Dunmore could find. The name on the permit was Cedral Structural Associates. No other document in any public record mentions Cedral Structural Associates. Not a tax filing, not a business license, not a letterhead. The name exists only once, on one permit, for one room. The room has its own electrical circuit, separate from the main grid of the building. It runs through a conduit that does not show up on any wiring diagram for the property. It has its own ventilation system, a sealed loop that neither draws from nor exhausts into the building's shared air handling. These details surfaced not from any official statement, but from a facilities inspection report created in 2003 while part of the building's HVAC system was being upgraded. The contractor who wrote the report flagged both oddities and noted in his final summary that further investigation would require access to a room for which he had not received entry clearance. The report was filed, acknowledged, and no action was taken. But it was Dunmore who found the last detail, buried in a supplementary structural survey attached to the original 1960 permits. Section R is supported by a load-bearing column that does not appear on any diagram of the building's structural systems. Not the original plans, not the renovation surveys from 1988, not the engineering assessment completed after a minor seismic event in 2011. The column wasn't retrofitted into the structure, wasn't braced against an existing wall, but rose from its own independent foundation, sunk separately into the bedrock beneath the building. As if the room had been planned before the building itself existed, the first person on record to seriously push on the question was a contractor named Hendricks, brought in during the summer of 1994 to gut and refurbish the 14th floor's eastern corridor. Hendricks noticed the locked door on his first walkthrough. It sat at the far end of the corridor, past the last office, set slightly deeper into the wall than anything else on the floor. The frame was different, heavier. The gap beneath it was sealed with a strip of material he didn't recognize and couldn't pry at with his thumbnail. He asked the Vantis facilities manager about it that same afternoon. The manager told him the room was out of scope and contained archival environmental equipment. Hendricks asked what that meant. The manager repeated it. He pressed a third time, and the manager disappeared for 40 minutes, returned with a document in a manila folder, held it open long enough for Hendricks to read the first paragraph, and then closed it. Hendricks later described the document as an official authorization of some kind, with language about restricted infrastructure and federal compliance protocols, though he couldn't be certain of the exact wording because he hadn't been allowed to hold it or photograph it. He dropped the question. His crew finished the eastern corridor, avoided the door without being explicitly told to, and completed the job 11 days later. 14 years passed. The room remained locked. The fluorescent above it continued its irregular flickering, which the maintenance logs attributed to a wiring fault that no technician could locate or confirm. Then, in the spring of 2008, a journalist named Petra Wolfe began investigating Vantis Solutions as part of a broader piece on corporate real estate anomalies, the kind of story that required months of records requests and conversations with former employees who preferred not to be named. She had identified a pattern: companies that held properties without any apparent operational reason to do so, buildings that appeared on balance sheets but generated no revenue, no client traffic, no recorded use. Vantis and the Meridian Street building were in the middle of her list. She visited the building twice as a prospective tenant, which got her onto the 14th floor long enough to walk its length. On her second visit, she reached the door at the end of the eastern corridor and knocked. She described what she heard to at least 2 colleagues afterward. It wasn't a mechanical sound, she said. Not a hum, not pipes, not the cycling of any equipment she could name. It was more like pressure shifting, the way a room sounds when the air inside it moves toward the door from the other side. A slow, dense displacement, as though something behind the door had registered the knock and adjusted itself in response. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, she said, and then walked back down the corridor without knocking again. Petra Wolfe never published the piece. She shelved it without explanation and moved to a different editorial position the following year. The notes from her investigation have not surfaced in any form. Carla had read enough by 2021 to know that pressing Vantis directly would accomplish nothing. She had spent the better part of 2 years building a picture from secondary sources, and the picture consistently pointed back to the same conclusion. Whatever access existed to that room, it did not come through official channels. She obtained a maintenance master key through a facilities contact on the 3rd floor, a key that was documented to open every locked door in the building, every stairwell gate, every server closet, every storage room on all 22 floors. She went to the 14th floor on a quiet Tuesday morning before the offices filled. The corridor was cold in the way she had come to expect, colder than the building's climate systems could explain, a cold that felt less like temperature and more like the air had been replaced with something thinner and older. She raised the key toward the lock. There was no lock. Where a keyhole should have been, there was a smooth, dark plate, flush with the door, featureless, without seam or mechanism, or any indication that it had ever accommodated a key of any kind. She ran her fingers across it. The metal was cold in a way that was distinct from the air around it, colder than the door itself, colder than anything the corridor's ambient temperature could account for. Carla stood in that hallway with a master key that fit every other door on every other floor and pressed it uselessly against a plate of featureless dark metal that offered no opening, no gap, no concession of any kind to the idea that it had ever been meant to be unlocked from the outside. Vantis Solutions has a LinkedIn page, a mission statement about integrated professional services, and a client testimonial from a logistics company in Cincinnati. It has filed its taxes without incident every year since 1987. It employs somewhere in the range of 300 people across 4 offices, maintains a functional website with stock photography of people in conference rooms, and has never, as far as any available record shows, been the subject of a regulatory action, a fraud investigation, or any public dispute of consequence. By every measurable standard, it is a real company doing real work, and there is nothing in its public profile that would cause a reasonable person to look twice. The founding documents are a different matter. Buried in the incorporation filings, registered in Delaware in the spring of 1987, is a clause that does not appear in the founding documents of companies that exist solely to provide professional services. It restricts the modification, transfer, or inspection of what it calls legacy infrastructure assets at the Meridian Street property. and it binds that restriction in perpetuity, meaning it survives any change of corporate ownership, any restructuring, any dissolution and reconstitution of the company itself. The language is specific enough to have been written by someone who anticipated every possible mechanism by which the clause might later be circumvented. It is the kind of language produced not by a cautious attorney hedging against liability, but by someone who understood exactly what needed protecting and how far that protection needed to extend. That clause is the only place in Vantis's founding documents where the Meridian Street building appears at all. There is no mention of it as a headquarters, no listing of it as a primary or secondary asset, no reference to it as a place of business. The building is not mentioned because Vantis conducts business there. The building is mentioned because Vantis was incorporated, at least in part, to ensure that something already inside it remained exactly as it was. They did not acquire the building in order to use it. They acquired it in order to maintain something that had already been there, under a prior corporate owner, through a change of hands that itself remains only partially documented. Vantis was not the builder. Vantis was the custodian. The distinction matters enormously, because it means that whatever obligation they are discharging is older than the company itself. A former compliance officer at Vantis wrote about this in 2017 in a post on a forum whose subject matter was corporate anomalies and regulatory obscurities. He did not use his real name. He described his first week on the job, the ordinary texture of it, the onboarding documents and the introductions and the orientation sessions, and then a meeting with a senior partner, unscheduled, held in a room he had not previously been shown. The senior partner told him that one component of his compliance role, a component not reflected anywhere in his written job description, was to ensure that a specific room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Street property was never opened, never disturbed, and never discussed internally or externally by any member of the firm. He was told this was a legacy obligation. He was told it was non-negotiable. He was told, and this is the phrase he repeated in the post, that the room was not a matter for curiosity, that curiosity about it specifically was considered a professional liability. The senior partner did not explain what was inside. The compliance officer wrote that he had the distinct impression that the senior partner did not know either, and that this did not trouble the senior partner in the way that it immediately and persistently troubled him. He deleted the post 53 minutes after publishing it. The post was deleted 53 minutes after it was published, but the screenshot had already been copied 4 times, and the username traced back to a compliance officer named Gerald Foss, who left Vantis's employment the following month and has given no interviews since. Carla has described what she found in that room to 3 people, each time in a slightly different order, each time with the same expression, which is the expression of someone trying to explain a colour that doesn't exist. She arrived at the building at 11:40 p.m. on a Thursday in late October, having told nobody where she was going. 3 months of research into magnetic lock mechanisms and bypass hardware had produced a small kit she carried in a canvas bag, methodical and quiet, the way a person carries something they have convinced themselves is reasonable. The lobby guard was not at his desk. The elevator to the 14th floor rose without stopping. She would later note that detail. The elevator, which normally paused at 9 and 11 on any given night, rose without stopping, as if something had already cleared the way. The corridor was colder than it should have been. Not the ambient chill of a building at night with the HVAC dialed back, but a specific, directional cold that seemed to originate from the door itself, radiating outward into the hall the way heat radiates from a furnace, except entirely in reverse. The fluorescent above the door was flickering. She had seen it flicker before, in passing, during the ordinary daylight hours of her working week, but now it pulsed with a slow, almost metered rhythm that she would describe afterward as breathing. Not her word for it, she insisted. The light's word for it. The interval between each flicker was too consistent to be electrical fault. The bypass worked. It took 11 minutes, and then the door, which had not opened in anyone's living memory, swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all. The darkness inside was not ordinary. That is not a dramatic assessment. Carla is precise, careful, the kind of person who tracks budget discrepancies to the decimal, and she used the word resistant. The darkness resisted her flashlight beam in a way she could not account for, absorbing it, she said, rather than simply stopping it. The beam reached perhaps 4 feet before it seemed to lose conviction. The air that moved against her face when the door opened was not stale in the way sealed rooms are stale. It was older than that. The smell that came with it produced in her, immediately and without any intellectual scaffolding whatsoever, a fear response she could not trace to any source. Not rot, not chemicals. Something that predated those categories entirely. Something her body recognized and her mind could not name. She stepped inside. The room was not empty. Along the walls, shapes she could not identify occupied the space where equipment should have been. Not computers, not servers, not anything that corresponded to any technology she had encountered or read about. They had surfaces, edges, some kind of intentional geometry, but the geometry did not resolve into function the way designed objects do. She moved the beam across them and felt, she said, that they were not quite indifferent to being looked at. In the center of the room stood a structure roughly 4 feet across, cylindrical approximately, covered in a material that was either very dark metal or something for which she had no adequate word. It did not reflect the flashlight. It occupied its space with a settled, absolute solidity. The way load-bearing things occupy space, things that have been exactly where they are for a very long time. It hummed. The vibration reached her sternum before she consciously registered it as sound. It was not mechanical. It was not the hum of electronics or ventilation or any process she could place inside the framework of the building's functioning systems. It was simply there, persistent, emanating from the structure at a frequency that seemed calibrated to something beneath hearing and above comfort. She stood in the room for what she believes was between 2 and 4 minutes. She did not touch anything. She says she did not touch anything. She pulled the door shut behind her, stood in the hallway under the flickering light with her heart slamming against her ribs, and understood with a clarity she found more frightening than anything she had seen inside that whoever built that room had not been trying to keep people out of it, but to keep whatever was in there from knowing the door existed at all.